I am here with Corey Good, and I'm also here with Dr. Bob Wood. And Dr. Bob Wood is going to be our focus. Part of the reason why is that he has been acquainted with William Tompkins since 2009 and knows a great deal about Tompkins' testimony. In fact, he's practically a walking encyclopedia of what Tompkins knows. But Bob, you also are coming into this with a lifetime of very bizarre, interesting experiences related to this whole topic of cosmic disclosure. So I just want to hand it over to you now. And I know you said that you have some very critical autobiographical information you want to give us about yourself that will become very relevant as we go forward in your story and the timelines of what's happened to you.
Yes. It started actually in 1949 at the University of Colorado when I graduated. And after then, I got a job at Douglas Aircraft Company for the summer because my father was a professor and he was always talking with the guys who were hiring engineers. So
Douglas is the same company that William Tompkins worked for.
Exactly. It was
right.
Douglas at that time. It merged to McDonnell Douglas in 1968.
Right.
So my first summer job was working on missiles. In fact, I worked for some of the same people that later, it turns out, Bill Tompkins was working for.
That's wild.
It is wild. But actually...
Could you give us a couple names?
Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. Klemper was one of them, Wolfgang Klemper.
Klemper, right. He calls him Klemp in the book sometimes.
That's right, yeah. And the other one was Elmer Wheaton. Elmer Wheaton later became a vice president of Douglas until he got hired by Lockheed. So after one summer job, I went to start to get my PhD. Then I had a break, and I took another summer job and worked for some of the same guys. But it was interesting that at that time, I looked around to see if there were any vaults or secret things going on, and I was told there weren't any, and I didn't ever notice any. But it turned out that towards the end of that summer, at that same time, if I'd been paying attention, I could have seen Bill Tompkins walking down the aisle.
No kidding.
Yeah. So there I went on and got my PhD, and then I went to work for Douglas until they drafted me. I went to work for the Aberdeen Proving Ground for a couple of years and worked on ballistic shell dynamics. It was a good experience. With that behind me, then I was asked to select an area, and so I selected thermodynamics because they were really starting to build. Actually, it was the Air Force DM-18 that Bill Tompkins worked on. It was a Thor missile at the time,
right?
And they worried about whether the back of this Thor missile would get hot. And so that was one of the challenges. Actually, I spent most of my time early on working on the Nike Zeus missile and actually hired Jerry Buss of known fame now, who was a chemist, to decide how much Teflon we should put on the leading edges of the fins in this missile to keep it cool. Well, anyway, my career went on, and I got involved in the aerospace management. We managed the independent research and development program, and I got involved in the space station design later on, and finally in 1993, I retired. But in 1968, there was an unusual event that happened that caused me to become involved in UFOs. It was pretty simple. My boss said, hey, I've got to give a briefing to the Air Force next week, and they want to know 10 years from now how we would go to orbit and back. And I said, well, just for a joke, I said, well, Ray, why don't we tell them how the alleged UFOs would do it? And he said, that's a great idea. Why don't you work on that? So I read my first UFO book, and it was by Don Menzel.
In 1968?
1968.
Wow.
I read my first UFO book, and I kind of concluded, I don't care if this guy is a famous astronomer, he's obviously ignoring the data. So I read more books, and the briefing went off okay. But a year later, my boss is out of town, and his bosses had me give the usual report on how we were doing on contracts and that sort of thing. And at the end of this meeting, he said, by the way, Dr. Wood, you know, we don't often see you. Tell us what you're doing that's interesting. I said, well, you're not going to believe this, but I've read 50 UFO books in the last year, and I've concluded that everything is certain. That is, we know that there's aliens coming here in spacecraft. The only thing that's not sure is whether we figure out how they work before or after our Lockheed competitor. And there was a moment of silence, and my boss said, what do you think it would take to look into that? So for the next year and a half, actually they gave us $500,000. I hired Stan Friedman, who's now a well-known UFO guy, to read the literature and see whether or not there was something in the literature that would tell us how they work. We had a laboratory, we did laboratory tests, we hired a detective to interview abductees and stuff like that, which in those days was, you know, kind of outside the norm.
So what were you thinking, Bob, when you're seeing obviously all this data? You're obviously a credible, credentialed PhD.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking into this data scientifically. You have a $500,000 budget in 1968 dollars.
Yeah.
And then you're looking at the public and how the media is presenting this as if it's a big farce and it's a joke. And oh, it's all swamp gas. What did you feel about that at the time?
Well, that's when the swamp gas report first came out. It's
right.
actually that era. It turns out that I was focused on learning something. And so I joined organizations I thought were relevant, MUFON and QFOS, and I wound up meeting James McDonald. And so whenever he came to town, he and I would go to his lectures, and I became pretty aware of the work that he did. Now, he was the one who said, you ought to go visit the Condon Committee and tell them what you think.
Wow.
So I did. Went to the Condon Committee. And I said, well, you know, I told Condon and his committee, he said, you know, we're doing a little study, and we did come up with one way that you could build a UFO that would potentially work. It would say you could hover in the Earth's magnetic field. So I went through the designs, and it turned out it doesn't work because it's not practical. But at the end of this visit, I decided that I would write Professor Condon a memo, a note, which I had properly approved. And I had suggested to him that maybe he could divide his team up into two parts, the part of the believers and the non-believers, the skeptics. And he got this letter. I also, in this letter, decided that I would send a copy to everybody on his committee. And I mentioned that. Well, he was so upset that he called up James S. McDonald on the phone and tried to get me fired.
Really?
Yeah. And I had no knowledge of this until months later when my vice presidential boss said that he had to deal with that. And fundamentally, James McDonald didn't like some university professor telling him how to run his business. Mm-hmm. And I had performed all the required approval signatures before this letter went out.
Could you just, for the viewer, I'm sure we're going to get comments if I don't say this, explain to people who James McDonald is?
James McDonald was one of the scientists and atmospheric physicists, actually, who really dug into the individual cases, especially those that involved radar, light, and all the physical cases. And he put them together so effectively that he testified to Congress that there were objects there.
Right.
So Jim McDonald and I became good friends and colleagues, and I was dismayed to find out that he'd committed suicide a couple of years later. I could never imagine that happening. But actually, I did. I was sufficiently friendly.
Do you think it was suicide or not? I mean, a lot of times these guys commit suicide.
I've now concluded with all the apparently classified work that the CIA has done on, you know, influencing people and psychotic drugs and stuff like that. You know, anything's possible.
Yeah.
But the one thing that it told me that about McDonald was really interesting is I knew him well enough that once I was going through Tucson in business, and I stopped off and he was willing to meet me at the airport. So we had been, you know, looking at the evidence, and he said, Bob, I think I finally figured out how it's working. And in hindsight, I have included what he'd found one of the top secret documents that said that we had really recovered lots of craft. In those days, that would have been a huge revelation. But he didn't tell me that. He just said, I finally found out what's really going on. And that was the last I knew. And the next thing I knew, he was dead.
Yeah, that sounds suspicious.
Well, it's really fascinating just to have you here and to be getting a window into this history of Project Blue Book and the whole very obvious government cover-up that was put in place. And for you to have been given the same budget money as the Condon report, but yet your findings obviously were not put on the same level in the media as the whitewash.
Well, actually, the reason for that was McDonald was, you know, he was really a pretty pressure guy. He said, you know, Dr. Wood, because of all the work you're doing, you ought to testify to Congress. Said,
right.
So he set it up so I could be on the congressional committee. Or I got an invitation from him, actually. So I consulted my management. I said, look, he said, you know, you guys are treating me pretty well. I'm, you know, deputy director and going on for a pretty good career, it seems like. And I've got this opportunity to testify before Congress. And one of the VPs, who was kind of my friend, he said, well, you know, he said, I don't ever remember knowing anybody who had a lot of good from coming to testify at Congress. So I thought about it a lot, and I decided, no, I wouldn't do it. And furthermore, right about that same time, we lost the MOLE program, and we just got an opportunity to bid on a ballistic missile program, defense program, and they didn't have any radar guys. So, and furthermore, in this project, we knew how fast we were spending the money, you know, on these 4 or 5 different aspects, but we didn't know how close we were getting to any answer. So we all agreed, let's kill it. So we stopped it in 1970.
1970.
And I made a deal with Stan Friedman that he would never talk about this, and we were going to write it up to tell the government what we'd done, and it turned out that our management decided, no, we'll pay for it right out of profits. We don't tell the government we're doing this subject. So then I became a radar expert for ballistic missile defense and for the next 10 years, and that turned out to be interesting too, because it gave me top secret clearance for stuff, and the CIA was a customer to study the Soviet ballistic missile defense program, and my career went on until I got assigned to the space station. So for the next 10 years, I worked at the space station, which is a lot of fun, you know. It's up there now.
Yeah. So you're talking about the International Space Station, the ISS?
The ISS,
okay.
Yeah. That was
what was your role in the ISS's development?
My role there was to try to make the space station cheaper, better, sooner, or safer by using advanced technology. And it turns out that it was a low-tech thing, and we made it out of aluminum, for heaven's sakes, you know. It's the cheapest. Right. So the question was, could we take any of this high sophisticated stuff that I'd been managing and get some benefit out of it by putting it on a space station? However, my career was sort of very conventional.
Right.
Except for this one little tweak there where I was working on the UFO program.
Sure.
And then when I retired, however, in the process of knowing about some classified material, I was working with a guy in a vault who was interested in some psychic stuff. So he introduced me to Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, who were working at Stanford. And so we took a visit up to Stanford, and I got exposed to remote viewing.
At Stanford Research, when they were actually doing that work?
Yeah, when they were doing that work.
Wow.
It was the 80s. And in fact, my enthusiastic guy in the vault said, well, why don't we turn in a proposal to James McDonald and try to do a coordinate remote viewing experiment. So we did. In remote viewing, a target is selected, a person is selected, and at the right time, the person is asked to describe the target, which they've never seen.
What would the target be, for example?
It could be a ship sinking in the ocean.
Okay.
Yeah, or a new type of radar on a ship that we haven't got a good look at.
Yeah.
Okay.
However, in this particular case, one of the things that had never been done at that time was to just use the coordinates. In other words, you take the coordinates, latitude and longitude, and those are the coordinates that are on a piece of paper. And the remote viewer is asked to describe what's at those coordinates.
So this is an intuitive psychic thing they're doing.
Right.
Okay.
So we did that. Actually, it turned out that James S. McDonald, without taking the proper advice of his lawyers, gave us $25,000 to do that. And then later on, they found out what he'd done and said, never do that again. Well, that was just a minor portion of everything I did. What happened, however, was that I met Hal Puthoff, who exposed me to the fact that there were people who were thinking about things psychically, and I became active in the SSE, Society for Scientific Exploration, a group of university professors typically who are willing to think outside the box. In any case, I retired in 1993, having had what I thought was a fun, successful career, you know, beginning with the missiles and ending with the space station. and having lots of fun on classified work in between.
Yeah.
So couldn't have had a better career. So then, in about 1995, my former longtime friend, Stan Friedman, who had been my first employee, called me up and said, "Hey, I've got a fax that looks like it's a classified document. I got it from a guy by the name of Don Berliner who works in this area." He said, "It's sort of a fax. It's called Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology Recovery and Disposal. Would you like to try to authenticate it?"
Wow.
And I said, "Well, sure. I'm not doing anything." so I went and I visited and got the high-quality copies of this document, which was a Special Operations Manual 1-01, and replicated it in great detail, and went and talked to a guy at the printing office and showed him the document. And he read it. It was stamped top secret, which is a little bit awkward, but...
Right.
Yeah. Approach him. "Oh, by the way, I have top secret document in hand." Yeah. That doesn't go over real well. But I'm surprised he touched it.
Yeah, no, he read it. And then he put it down and he said, he said, "Based on the content, I'd say it's a hoax."
Uh-huh.
But,
Based on the content.
Yeah, based on, however, he said, if I look at the details of the font that was used in that area, furthermore, he said the tail of the F and the G are specifically relevant to that. In addition, he said, I found that there's 3 raised Z's in this document. And I said, "Well, what's that about?" And he said, "Well, what happens is when you have a hot lead printing press, it turns out that a rarely used letter, like the Z, gets some crud underneath it and doesn't properly seat. And so you can read a document once in a while, you'll find that those Z's are slightly raised off of the base." And he said, "I found 3 Z's in this document that are raised, therefore I know that it was printed on a hot lead printing press, and it would have had been in that era, 1954. So he said, this was clearly printed on one of our printing presses, either in the basement of the Pentagon or right in this building here.
Yeah, because he would be familiar enough to know the typeset, where things are placed on the page, how the dates are arranged, everything.
Right. So anyway, my son, who had met Stanton Friedman when he was 15 years old, got interested in this stuff, and he and I became partners. So we gave a speech at one of the UFO meetings in Connecticut, and at that meeting they were responded by saying, "Wow, this is the first time we've seen anything that seems to be analytically evaluated and has an authenticity aspect that is pretty good." So I declared that I was going to become authenticating documents, but in the meantime, another person came out of the woodwork that Stan Friedman had heard from, Timothy Cooper, who lived in Big Bear Lake. And nobody had ever gone to see Timothy Cooper. So Stan asked me if I'd go see him because I lived closer than he did in Canada. I said, sure. So I went to see Timothy Cooper, and Timothy said he was delighted to have somebody actually pay attention to the fact that he had some classified documents, and he went over the background with them and all that. Well, it's a kind of a long story, but in effect, it put me in well known in the business of being a document authenticator. So I've been able to establish that kind of as my expertise area. And along the way, I got asked by Joe Firmage to make us, well, actually to authenticate his documents. And
really?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Joe Firmage is this guy who had a very large amount of money, who popped up for a while in the late 1990s and wanted to finance UFO investigations.
That's correct.
Right, so you actually worked for him.
Well, I don't want to say anything on this show that would be inappropriate, but I think that what actually happened is perfectly okay. What happened was that Joe Firmage had heard the word that I had some of these documents that I was trying to authenticate. So he called me up out of the blue and he said, "Hi, I'm Joe Firmage." He said, "I've got a yacht in Newport Beach. You live in Newport Beach." He said, if I could authenticate those documents, would you be interested in lending them to me? And I said, well, let me think about that. And I called up, and he said, if you want to check me out, you can check Hal Prutoff. He knows me. Right. So I hung up with Joe and then called up Hal and said, who's this guy? And he said, well, he's a good guy.
Yeah.
And
he's not going to steal the documents.
That's right. So,
that's what happens a lot.
So in the meantime, in this conversation, Joe had asked me, well, what do you think they're worth? And I said, I don't know. They might be worth millions. So anyway, had the meeting. My wife, in the meantime, had wondered why I'd been wasting all my time since I retired studying UFOs. So I went down to this meeting, and Joe looked the documents over and said, this is exactly what I want, Dr. Wood. What I like to do is I like to borrow these, have them authenticated, and if they're authentic, I'll print 2,000 copies of them for you under your specifications, and you can have them all back. And so I said, well, Joe, that's it? That's your proposition? And he said, oh, no, I forgot something. He opened up his briefcase and took out a check for $500,000 already made out to me.
Oh, my gosh.
So I got on the phone with my son, and we couldn't figure out any reason to not accept the offer.
Yeah, that's kind of a hard thing to turn down, yeah. No strings attached.
And I went home and showed my wife, this check. She said, how'd the meeting go? I said, well, here's the answer. And she said, how'd you know it's any good? So
she didn't mind you looking into UFOs after that, probably.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly right, yeah. So we checked it out. Turns out it was in the same bank I banked with. And then Monday morning, I went, it was good. Called up Joe and said, Joe, you want to go ahead with this deal? And he said, yes. He said, I want you to do that.
Wow.
Cash the check. So that turned out to be very effective. Joe did everything he said he would do. He got it all printed, helped assigned his company to help work with my son and me for that. And then he liked the whole idea so much of the secrecy of the country and so forth that he wanted to do a television documentary called The Secret, where we took the essential ingredients of our authenticity procedures and tried to share them on this television documentary.
So just to be clear, this is not the movie The Secret that says that you can ask the universe for as much money as you want and the universe gives you the money.
It's a different movie. It's called
In a Different Secret.
The full title of the movie is The Secret, Evidence We Are Not Alone.
Okay. So how are you familiar with Corey Goode's work? Let's just divert a little bit into that. Have you heard about it online, or how did you find out about what he was saying?
Well, actually, I hadn't heard of Corey Goode until a year ago.
Okay.
Yeah. And the reason for that was because and this relates actually to Bill Tompkins. I met Bill Tompkins in 2009. He said that he'd been trying to write his autobiography for nearly a decade. He'd tried with several various editors and writers, and they were never able to squeeze anything out that was like a book. Mm. And he was wondering whether I'd be willing to try it. So we began to become acquainted, and I went through the process of actually taking the words that Bill started with and turning them into a book. Mm. And that's not a trivial process.
Sure.
But as the book selected by extraterrestrials got published, it turned out that Michael Salla, who is a well-known researcher and author, had just published a book about the secret space program, and he said he wanted to interview Bill Tompkins. Would I help him do that? So I decided that I'd want to know something about Salla before I did that, even though I'd known him some years before. I hadn't read his recent work. So I bought his book, The Secret Space Program. Yeah. And that's where your name, I think, first saw.
First popped up for you.
Yeah. So I read this book. I said, wow, there's more to this than I thought. I never imagined there might have been a secret space program. And then as I started to think about what Bill had been showing me, namely images that he had drawn in 1954 of 1 kilometer long spacecraft, that it might have been the beginnings of a Navy program that could have become something like Solar Warden, which is presumably one of potentially several space programs that may indeed be in existence. So it's just in the last year that my mind has suddenly been able to grasp the idea that we might really have had these secret space programs. In fact, if there's any one thing I've learned now that I didn't know 5 years ago, is the incredible level of secrecy in this government for this and other subjects. Absolutely incredible. That people if you try to tell somebody that the Nazis had a base on the far side of the moon in 45, they'll look at you as if you're from some other world. So I've tried this technique. If I can convince you that the Nazis had a space base on the moon in 1945, would you believe everything else I'm going to tell you?
So Corey, Bob walked in today with a piece of paper printed out, high resolution, of a diagram that Tompkins made of one of these craft that he was working on.
One of the cigar-shaped ones.
Cigar-shaped, modular, lots of little blocks that all are built to be able to fit together and build one of these. What was your feeling when you saw that?
Well, actually, before I had seen it, I had worked with an artist to depict one of these craft, and they were very similar.
Really?
Very similar. And they were indeed very modular. Everything was, the whole middle of the craft was the walls could come in real close, or it could be pushed way back, and they could build modular rooms to do research in them. So a lot of what he designed, came about.
Well, one of the things that excites me is the fact that the things that everything he says he did, when I've been able to confirm it, was exactly correct. All the people that he said he knew, I knew those same people.
And his documentation is just unbelievable.
Right.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Right.
I wouldn't say unbelievable. I mean, it's completely believable. I mean, and you've verified it.
But the fact that he was, for example, working in this think tank, it's what he called it, a think tank instead of a vault. And in his think tank with Klemperer and Wheaton, every so often they get a phone call from the Navy. Well, one of the people who he said occasionally called was Bobby Ray Inman. And
Wow.
I checked to find out how old he would have been, and he would have been just, starting up in his career, maybe as a lieutenant or something like that. And he was the guy who was telling Tompkins' group what to do next. So you put that together with the fact that this kilometer-long craft kind of resembles what the Navy might have built later, would seem to be consistent with the Navy having been involved in that process. The wide variety of things that Tompkins worked on in TRW is pretty exciting to me. And he said that they had a green light to look on anything that was interesting in the whole world. How were the pyramids really built? How do you keep somebody living forever, or as long as the pharaohs used to live? How do you do that? And there was nothing that was off limits. How do UFOs work? And of course, one of the things that most people are surprised at is that Bill has direct testimony, the fact that the RAND Corporation was specifically formed by Douglas in order to study the alien problem.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's pretty big.
Yeah. But, well, my comments on RAND would be that I think they have modified a great deal from their original purpose. I think when they started, they hired two groups. They decided to have a group of people who were given the real data that the Navy had presumably recovered from the Battle of L.A. crash. And then they had another group of people who were sort of skeptical scientists who would be willing to ask the question of what would it take to have intelligent life visit us, and how would you do that? And it turned out that my uncle, that is my first wife, from my first wife, was an employee of RAND in the second category. And he and I had many first-hand conversations, and he was the classic skeptical physicist and tried to prove to me that if you can't travel faster than the speed of light, nothing will happen. But now Bill Tompkins is saying that there was another part of RAND that was studying the real data. And he didn't know anything more about what RAND was doing, though. All he knew was what he was doing in the vault. And what he was doing in the vault was based on what he was being told. I don't think he ever claims to have seen any recovered parts.
I'm curious about the timing of Tompkins coming forward. I mean, yes, you say he was working on his book for 10 years, but we have Corey, who was given briefings saying that multiple insiders were going to come forward who would be able to corroborate what he said. And I'm really curious about your thoughts on I mean, you say that there was no direct involvement in the writing of Tompkins' book with intelligence services or anything like that. But as far as you know, you're authorized to say whatever you want to say? You're cleared to come forward like this?
Me? Yeah. I'm cleared to say anything I want to say.
Okay.
And the only risk I worry about is I don't want to say anything that would cause a libel suit or anything like that. But other than that,
sure.
Perfectly.
I'm sure there's other classified things you worked on that don't pertain to this that you can't talk about.
Well, actually, the only classified thing that I worked on was really not very exciting. You know, since we were experts in ballistic missile defense, this group I managed was experts in the Soviet ballistic missile defense. And that's what I studied, is how did the Soviets defend against our missiles. Well, it's no big deal. You'd expect them to have a program like that. I mean, the other thing would be classified was the details of how they did it. And the fact that actually some of their ideas were better than ours, that would have been classified.
Well, we also had a conversation, and I might be throwing you in a little bit by saying this, but where Tompkins told me that he's still on the inside.
I'm a little mystified about why Bill won't tell me 100% of everything. He does show that he is still appears to be invited to the annual West conference that the Navy has with the clearances that get him into rooms he shouldn't be into. And in fact, that happened just this year. Someone has determined that even at his age, he's perfectly willing to be told about things that nobody knows about. He went to into one room where he saw information on Solar Warden.
Really?
Yeah.
At one of these classified
The last
briefings?
one.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
There's nobody there but contractors. So,
are you aware that Corey worked in Solar Warden?
well, yeah, I assume that.
Right.
Yeah.
That was the 80s project.
But
Yeah.
did you, Corey, deal with contractors in the program?
No. There were civilians. There were civilian, what they called eggheads, scientists, and engineers, and that type of thing. But there was never discussion of who they worked for corporation-wise, if they did work for a corporation, or if they were just recruited. So
I see.
I don't know if any of those people worked at any of these defense.
But the assignment that you had would not have given you normally much information about the management structure.
Right. You really didn't learn a whole lot about anything a tier above you, and you would learn a little bit about some of the people you were working with. Yeah. But information didn't flow real freely when on command structure.
Yeah.
If Tompkins is still having these meetings and he still has this clearance, and you seem to believe that's true.
Yeah, I don't think he's really being told anything very specific on a regular basis. He claims that he was told by Webster to tell it all. I think that's on the back cover of the book. It says,
and who's Webster now?
He's an admiral that he knew personally, I think when he lived in Oregon, perhaps.
Okay.
A retired admiral.
Okay.
And he said, tell it all. And so that's why Bill feels comfortable in telling it all.
I want to ask you just a really brief opinion question, and that is, what was it like for you to encounter Corey's testimony and see so many astonishing crossovers to what you had been gathering from Tompkins in the preceding 7 years? What was that like for you?
I've concluded that your involvement could conceivably have been the ultimate result of what Tompkins might have started. But my feeling is that Tompkins didn't have any way of following that in detail. I really don't think that he, and I talked to him today, actually. I didn't ask him this question, but I don't think that he had any knowledge of a Navy space program while it was being developed at all.
All right, well, this is all the time we have for in this episode of Cosmic Disclosure. I hope you've enjoyed it. This is a really valuable window into the history of ufology. And here we have somebody who was right on the front lines of this fight for full disclosure, which I do believe we are going to get, and this show is part of that process. I'm David Wilcock, here with Dr. Bob Wood and Corey Good. and I thank you for watching. I am here with Corey Good, and I'm also here with Dr. Bob Wood. And Dr. Bob Wood is going to be our focus. Part of the reason why is that he has been acquainted with William Tompkins since 2009 and knows a great deal about Tompkins' testimony. In fact, he's practically a walking encyclopedia of what Tompkins knows. But Bob, you also are coming into this with a lifetime of very bizarre, interesting experiences related to this whole topic of cosmic disclosure. So I just want to hand it over to you now, and I know you said that you have some very critical autobiographical information you want to give us about yourself that will become very relevant as we go forward in your story and the timelines of what's happened to you.
Yes. It started actually in 1949 at the University of Colorado when I graduated. And after then, I got a job at Douglas Aircraft Company for the summer because my father was a professor and he was always talking with the guys who were hiring engineers. So
Douglas is the same company that William Tompkins worked for.
Exactly. It was
right.
Douglas at that time. It merged to McDonnell Douglas in 1968.
Right.
So my first summer job was working on missiles. In fact, I worked for some of the same people that I later, it turns out, the challenges. Actually spent most of my time early on working on the Nike Zeus missile and actually hired Jerry Buss of known fame now, who was a chemist, to decide how much Teflon we should put on the leading edges of the fins in this missile to keep it cool. Well, anyway, my career went on, and I got involved in the aerospace management. We managed the independent research and development program, and I got involved in the space station design later on, and finally in 1993, I retired. But in 1968, there was an unusual event that happened that caused me to become involved in UFOs. It was pretty simple. My boss said, hey, I've got to give a briefing to the Air Force next week. If I'd been paying attention, I could have seen Bill Tompkins walking down the aisle.
No kidding.
Yeah. So there I went on, got my PhD, and then I went to work for Douglas until they drafted me. I went to work for the Aberdeen Proving Ground for a couple of years and worked on ballistic, shell dynamics. It was a good experience. With that behind me, then I was asked to select an area, and so I selected thermodynamics because they were really starting to build. Actually, it was the Air Force GM-18 that Bill Tompkins worked on. It was a Thor missile at the time,
right? And
they worried about whether the back of this Thor missile would get hot. And so that was one of the Tompkins was working for.
That's wild.
It is wild. But actually...
Could you give us a couple names?
Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. Klemper was one of them, Wolfgang Klemper.
Klemper, right. He calls him Klemp in the book sometimes.
That's right, yeah. And the other one was Elmer Wheaton. Elmer Wheaton later became a vice president of Douglas until he got hired by Lockheed. So after one summer job, I went to start to get my PhD. Then I had a break, and I took another summer job and worked for some of the same guys. But it was interesting that at that time, I looked around to see if there were any vaults or secret things going on, and I was told there weren't any, and I didn't ever notice any. But it turns out, towards the end of that summer, at that same time,